Because we did do this through a PowerPoint presentation as well, but I appreciate that it's a full house, but it's not for me, it's for this quilt. As you can see, it's a very unique quilt in that it's got a very great condition, and it's the story behind it that leads to the fact that it really never got used, and for most of its 151 years sat in a box and ultimately framed in our home. And so that's why I've thought about this story for quite a long time, and I've mostly focused the story on the Civil War soldier that it was made for. But as I began to think about today's event and about quilting, and you'll hear a little bit more about why I've thought this, it's really the story of the family, and the family who put this all together, and the family who supported the soldier and ultimately supported the Union at a very difficult time in our history. And so I've thought that the appropriate title for today is The Fabric of America, a Civil War Quilt. The soldier, his name was Lawrence H.C. Bruce. H.C. was for Henry Clay, because as we'll all remember from our history, Henry Clay was the great compromiser. And so the Civil War was the destruction of the compromise that was the compromise over slavery. And so when people say, well, what was the Civil War really about? It really was only about slavery and the effect of slavery on our country. And it took 4 bloody and brutal years for that issue that looks in our past as so distant and so abhorrent, but really was an issue that couldn't be resolved by the politicians such as Henry Clay and had to be resolved by the soldiers such as Lawrence Bruce. He was 18 years of age, and he was from Kossuth, Iowa. Kossuth, Iowa was a small hamlet, not really even a town, in southeastern Iowa. Burlington may be the closest that we would know where that is right now, and even today there's not much left of Kossuth, Iowa. One of the publications I read said that the only thing left in Kossuth, Iowa is the cemetery, which is surrounded by a monument to the Civil War soldiers who fought from this area. And that Civil War monument has Lawrence's name on it. He was a corporal in the Union Army, and as a corporal he got to be that because he actually was able to read and write. Many of the young farm boys who were enlisted into the Army didn't have that particular skill. He was in Company K and within the 14th Iowa Infantry. The 14th Iowa, as we're going to find out, had quite the career, and many of the types of battles that we've heard about and the stories that we've heard about and continue to hear about, they were very deeply involved. The 14th Iowa had about 1,759 men who enlisted. 59 of those men died of battle wounds. About 70 of those men died of disease. And so it really is the disease that was the biggest problem. When we talk about maybe advances in our culture as we forget how people could even have slaves, let alone understand why slavery was an issue, we also forget the advances in medicine and the advances of medicines that we have today. While we still don't want to send young men and now young women into battle, we do have medicine that they didn't have back then, and what ultimately was the downfall, as you'll find out, of Lawrence Bruce. And so the quilt itself, which we have here today, really is close to the quilt that was made for him in 1864. I was showing this particular site to my daughter, and she said, "Dad, I wonder why this particular quilt doesn't have all of the squares full." And as you're going to find out, I don't think this quilt was actually ever finished. It's going to turn out that this quilt needed to go and meet Lawrence probably before the 2 sisters had gotten there. So I think that's a pretty good theory, and you can tell me if you think I'm wrong, but it just made a little bit more sense. And since I'm not plagiarizing the idea, I've actually accredited it. The 14th Iowa Infantry was a Civil War regiment that started off with the capture of Fort Donaldson. Fort Donaldson was in Kentucky, and it was a stronghold for the Confederates. The Confederates had to move south, and after a series of devastating losses, there was a general named General Grant. This propelled him to fame. He had won at Fort Henry, which was primarily a naval battle along the river, and then Fort Donaldson. but it was the rally of the 14th Iowa that had actually taken the fort itself. And it was really through colorful language by a General Smith, who ends up dying from a disease right before the Battle of Shiloh. And General Smith had basically told the 14th Iowans that, you know, they're either going to die going forward or die going backwards, and it would surely be quite a bad thing to go home with a bullet in your back as opposed to a bullet in your front. So these young men decided to go forward and capture the fort. Well, that's when Grant really became the soldier. You know, he was unconditional surrender Grant because of the unconditional surrender that he demanded of Fort Donelson. It wasn't too long after that that we have the Battle of Shiloh, and that's the one you may have heard quite a bit of. It was in Tennessee. And it was the first of the big battles where so many people, so many casualties, about 23,000 casualties, which is about half as many casualties as we had in all of Vietnam over the course of 2 days. Within the first day, in the Hornet's Nest, the most difficult fighting had occurred. The 14th Iowa bore the brunt of the heaviest assault. And that's what I've read through this gentleman named McDonough. And it was a place of great dark horrors. And that's Groom. If you ever want to read about Shiloh, you really want to read what Groom has to say, because it's a great book. It's not just some academic's rendition of what happened at this battle. We all remember Groom for writing a book called Forrest Gump. And so he does a good job of actually making this readable. But yes, it's a place of dark horrors because the tactics of the battle hadn't caught up with the realities of what these weapons had done. And so the 14th Iowa had laid down, and it looked like there was a gap that the Confederates could go through. Well, as soon as they got close enough, they all rose up and fired. And they did that 4 times until the close of that day they had been surrounded. And so we have our friend Grant, who today we remember mostly just because he's on our $50 bill, right? Well, you don't think he'd have made the $50 bill if the Hornet's Nest hadn't stayed solid enough to make it so that the next day he could get the reinforcements and win the Battle of Shiloh. And so when the place of dark horrors and the 14th Iowa bearing the brunt of the heaviest assault, you can kind of get a sense of what was happening on the battlefield itself. Lawrence Bruce, along with the others from the 14th Iowa, were captured at that point in time and then got to spend some time in the prisoner of war camps. We hear about Andersonville and some of the Camp Douglas, even in the Union side. You know, Andersonville was horrible prisoner of war camp. Well, the Union soldiers, or the Union didn't treat the Confederate soldiers much better in Camp Douglas and Chicago. Terrible places. But this was early enough in the war where they would parole their captives and ultimately exchange them to go back fighting again. So, several of the 14th Iowa decided that they had had enough fighting. Lawrence did not. After he was exchanged, he went back. And for about a year then, they sat in Kentucky just manning a fort. Comparatively not a bad job. But then there was the Red River Campaign. It's a campaign that you're going to learn a little bit about today, because that's the story of this particular quilt, and it's the story of a diary that Lawrence left behind. And in that campaign, the idea was to go from New Orleans up the Red River and into Texas. And so if you can think of the map of Louisiana, the map of Louisiana would take you up to Shreveport, and that's the Red River, New Orleans up to Shreveport. And that was the goal, was to go up that river, and the result was coming back down that river. It didn't turn out quite so well. Or maybe we'll come at the end of today to a belief that it went well enough to help make sure that the Civil War ended the way it was supposed to. Back in 1864, no one knew how the Civil War was going to win. You know, the Confederates had made a lot of progress, and it had been a long time, and we had a new election, 1864. Would McClellan win and say, okay, we're going to have 2 countries, or would Lincoln win? All of that was going on in 1864. 14th Iowa was the first in and the last out, concluding with the Battle of Yellow Bayou. The very last shot was the at the Battle of Yellow Bayou. It enabled the Union to escape down to the Mississippi